Hey guys, this is Matt
and Biggs.
from Amped Airsoft to give you a little Air Tank 101 on your little Pleb to Pro this week. Yeah. Okay, so Biggs is going to take you through all of the important information that you need to know that is on your air tank, whether it be on the top or one of your little side labels. You guys are going to get learned it today to make sure you know everything you need to, so you do things safely, correctly, and know what you're doing with your air tank. Woohoo!
All right, so laid out in front of us is a series of all the tanks and sizes that we have in stock, all the way down from a 13 cubic inch up to a 90 cubic inch. There are a variety of styles, whether they're carbon fiber or aluminum. But as far as the numbers that are on them that are useful for an end user, we're going to go over those, and it's going to be on the top of the side labels, at least for carbon fiber tanks. It's a DOT number, and that's the serial number of this model of tank that is filed under our Department of Transportation. And then right below that, on the Ninja tanks, below the DOT, is a TC number, and that's for Transportation Canada, or Trans-Canada number. So that is the equivalent of the DOT for the US, but it's for Canadian regulations. So as followed, that's the number for that specific model tank. Now those numbers are useful for if you need to look up whether your tank cylinder is a 3 or 5 year cycle tank. And followed by those numbers, the DOT and TC are the pressure ratings capacity for that tank. The dot being in PSI and the TC being in bars, because that's what most other country standards are for pressure rating. So the next number that is useful for end users is a little bit lower than that. It starts with an M followed by about 4 digits. That's the manufacturer's number for any company that is in DOT, TC, or some of the international ratings. Usually next to that on the carbon fibers is a 2-digit number with a C emblem with a little L inside of it, followed by 2 digits, and that is your hydro date. The first one being the month and the next one being the year. So that is the hydro date, or also called a born-on date. So that is whenever the tank was manufactured, and it is good for up to 5 years after that. This one, for example, the number being 05 of 17, it is good until 05 of 2022.
Yep.
All right.
That's 5 years.
That's 5 years.
I can math.
And then on aluminum tanks, most of these numbers are in the same place. Or not the same place, but in the same order. They're along the top rim usually.
They're just a little bit more difficult to see.
Right, because they're stamped in rather than a actual label that is printed over. But it has the DOT underneath it. It'll have the TC still, and then it'll have the hydro date right after the TC normally. And then after that, it goes the manufacturer, and then it actually goes what size tank it is. So this one being a 48 says 48 CUIN, and that it's an air tank. So that's most of the information on carbon fibers are going to be around the top of the cylinder or on the head of the regulator. The last number that is a little bit useful for end users is the REE number.
Don't do it!
But the REE number is the expansion limit that it is tested under. That's the amount that the tank is allowed to expand without it being falling into like a catastrophic failure. As somebody who typed up my notes said, expansion limits to keep things from exploding.
Yeah, that's important. We don't want to die. I mean, some of you might, but please don't.
And if you've ever seen a carbon fiber tank that's exploded, they don't just blow the head off or something. Normally the whole side ruptures open, and in addition to pressure and shrapnel, it's also a lot of heat from the friction of the air coming out. So we went over the DOT and the TC numbers on the tanks. So for a lot more of our international customers, the number ratings that will be important to you are an ISO or a UN number ISO being the equivalent for DOT for Europe, and the UN number being for most other countries that don't have a specific department for that. But those numbers will, the UN will have a symbol that is a U above an N with a big circle around it, and then the ISO will just have the letters ISO in front of it. As well as on all tanks, they'll have the tank manufacturer or a name or logo present on them. Also, we have there are different construction types of tanks. So that basically you have your aluminums and carbon fibers. They're very visually different, either a little bit square with flat on the bottom, or a little bit more rounder, almost a cylinder.
Also, weight is huge.
Yes. So aluminum tanks are usually a little bit cheaper and heavier. They're also almost exclusively have a capacity of 3,000 psi, as opposed to the carbon fibers, which almost always have a 4,500 psi. So also the reason the weight is different is because aluminum tanks, they have to have a certain thickness to be able to keep up their structural integrity, whereas the carbon fiber, since they have several layers of carbon fiber wrapped over top, their aluminum shell on the inside can have a much thinner wall, allowing it to reduce some weight. So, but the carbon fiber keeping the strength in there. Now, as far as the primary regulator on the tank, which in airsoft, uniquely we sometimes call it a tank head, which isn't a correct technical term. It is a regulator, and what we screw on top is a secondary regulator. But the tank regulator normally has two types of outputs for our uses, and that's a standard pressure, in which it won't have any indicator of output pressure, or an SLP, which it'll have a specific labeling on it, SLP, which stands for super low pressure, or some other companies do ELP for extreme low pressure. But those two differences are standard pressure outputs being about 800 psi, and SLP tanks being about 300 psi. Currently, at least with the tanks we carry, there's not really a price difference. If it is, it's in the realm of like a couple dollars. But in the past, SLP tanks used to be a lot more expensive, about like $20 more. And that was due to the SLP regulators used to only be Pro Series V2 tanks, which would be a much faster refresh rate, which makes a little bit more of a difference in paintball. Doesn't really make that much difference in airsoft.
That is what this guy is.
Right. So some of the tanks, like this Super Light, which is also a different style, it still has the Pro Series V2. So in addition to it having a special body, which is about a pound lighter than its equivalent in a non-Super Light, it also has a Pro Series V2. The unique thing about the Pro Series V2 heads is this silver ring here. If you undo the two little grub screws or Allen screws on there, you can rotate it. So for airsoft, that's not really important because you're usually stowing it in a backpack, but in paintball, it allows you to adjust where your gauge is, so while you're using it, you can see where it is.
So when it comes to actual like performance and cost, what do you kind of recommend looking at, and what do you think the differences are as kind of price point changes?
Well, you really have to look into how you're playing. So if you're playing long periods of time and hauling a lot of stuff on you, you might want to look more into a 4500 or carbon fiber tank. Price point's going to be higher, but you're going to save in weight. Pounds equal pain, whereas they also have a higher storage capacity, 4500 being 50% higher than a 3000. So if you're on long hauls or long game types and you're already carrying a lot of stuff, you might want to go with the lighter tank and put out a little bit more money. Now you can save on that money if you're playing shorter game types, or you're going to a place that does airfields or stuff of that nature. Then you can save a little bit of money and go with a slightly heavier tank that is a little bit cheaper, which are the aluminum ones.
Now, what about dual tank options with some of like these smaller guys?
That's also another good one. So that comes into play a lot of times if you have space constrictions in the specific loadout you have. I know it was originally developed when one of our coworkers had a Pharaoh's Concept back panel.
Oh, Bauer.
In which any normal tank turned that back panel into like a turtle shell because it was so tight it would bubble out and you couldn't close it. So we figured out one of these is not really enough if you're running it in your backpack. For the air stocks, it's good because it's right there. You can change it out, whatnot. So we put 2 of them together for our dual tank setups. So depending on what HPA system you have, you get about 2,000 shots out of a dual 13 setup, which our dual low profile dual tank setups also fit the Tippmann 26-inch tanks, which will double that, so you'd be getting closer to 4,000 shots roughly, depending on what unit you have for a dual tank setup. We also have the dual any size tanks, would let you fit even up to 290s side by side. That's really, again, if you don't care how much weight you're carrying and you just want the air, usually good for like support gunners and stuff of that nature, where you just need air for shooting.
All right, so other than that, I know most aluminum tanks have directions on what you should do for maintenance and whatnot, but do you have any other tips besides all of those?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. First off, when storing your tank, when you're done for the day or when you're putting it away, it's best to keep a little bit of air in it. I recommend about 1,000 psi. It's not going to hurt it if you leave it completely filled, but I'd probably bottom it out at about 1,000 before putting it away. That way it keeps all of the O-rings pressurized so they don't dry out, as well as some of the internal mechanisms. It keeps the lubrication in place because all of the parts are sitting in place. It also helps with the tank, especially with it being a metal tank. It helps it so it's not any chance of it getting dinged or anything like that. Just think of it like a soda can. Whenever it's filled and pressurized, you're not going to be able to crush it, but when it's empty, crush is pretty easy. Not that you're going to crush this tank very easily, but there's also another little feature that works with some Ninja tanks. Definitely works with their Pro V2 series. I believe it also works with some of their standard ones. Check your manuals that comes in the box with your tank though. But normally there you can adjust the output of the tank down a little bit. So if you have a standard pressure that's about 800, you can adjust them down closer to like 600. I know some regulators require that, specifically the first generation of speed regulators, which you don't see too many of those out in the wild. But I remember the first generation, the book in it saying that if it is a ball valve style, like the newer Ninja ones, they have a higher flow rate, and that higher flow rate at the 800 psi was a little too much for it. So you can go inside, and there's a couple shims in there that you can remove and adjust the PSI down by doing so.
All right, guys, so we have more than a bajillion different kinds of sizes and options and tanks for you, but what do we actually have, Biggs?
So currently right now, we have them sized from smallest to largest, and the height of the tank can be deceiving. So we have our 13 3000s, and then we have our 48 3000s, and our 50 4500. So even though this looks much smaller than this, it has much more air. And then we have our 62 3000s, then our 77 4500 super lights, and then our 90 45 standards. So, and then most all of these come in a SLP and standard pressure. So you have all the varieties.
This has been Matt
And Biggs
with Air Tank 101 / Pleb to Pro. Bye.
Bye.